The lemon slice in my sweet tea was a perfect sunny wheel of yellow, floating on a sea of amber. It was the only thing in my world that still made sense. Across the table, Hope Carter, my husband's business partner's wife, and my son's mother-in-law, smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had called this morning, insisting on a quick lunch, something about a delicate matter. Now, sitting on my sun-drenched patio in Austin, the one Richard and I had designed together brick by brick, she finally got to the point. "My sister says Richard complains you're predictable," she said, her voice smooth as the pecan pie I'd just served her. "Old and boring" were her exact words, I think. She feels terrible about it, of course. The hum of the cicadas in the old oak tree suddenly sounded like a roar. My hand, the one holding the silver fork, stopped mid-air. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I could feel the blood drain from my face, a cold tide pulling away from my skin, leaving me numb. 64 years of life, 38 of them with Richard, had taught me how to keep my expression placid, a calm lake over a churning depth of feeling. I had been a teacher for 40 years. I had mastered the art of the unreadable face. Thank God for that. "Paige would never want to hurt you," Hope continued, taking a delicate bite of pie. She chewed thoughtfully, as if contemplating the flavor of my life's destruction. "But she's in love, and Richard, well, he wants a partner who can keep up with him, someone exciting." Paige, my daughter-in-law, the woman who called me Mom, the wife of my only son, Michael. The affair wasn't just a betrayal. It was an invasion, a contamination of every part of my family. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on my chest. I stared at Hope, at her perfectly manicured nails, her expensive silk blouse, the cold, triumphant gleam in her eyes. This wasn't a confession. It was a declaration of war. It's astonishing how your mind can splinter in a moment like this, racing in a dozen directions at once. I saw Richard's face that morning, the quick, distracted kiss on my cheek. I heard Paige's laughter at Sunday dinner last week, her arms slung around my son's shoulders. The entire architecture of my life revealed itself to be a house of cards, and this woman had just blown on it with a single venomous breath. But before we continue, make sure you've subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. We're really happy to know that our stories have reached people everywhere. Hope leaned forward, placing her fork down with a soft click against the china. "She doesn't want to be cruel, Caroline, but she wants the house. Her lawyer says if you contest the divorce, things could get ugly. She thinks it's better if you just agree. A clean break. She gets the house, Richard gets his freedom, and you, well, you can find a nice little condo somewhere." There it was. Not just infidelity, but a meticulously planned heist. They hadn't just stolen my husband. They were coming for my home, my security, my entire future. They had discussed lawyers. They had assessed my worth and decided on my eviction. And they had sent this woman, Paige's own sister, to deliver the terms of my surrender. They saw me as a relic, a piece of old furniture to be discarded with the rest of the life they were tearing down. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot poker branding itself onto my heart. My hand was steady as I lifted my glass of sweet tea. The ice cubes clinked softly, a sound of pure, simple normalcy in a world gone mad. I took a slow sip. My mind was suddenly terrifyingly clear. They expected tears. They expected hysterics. They expected a broken old woman to crumble. An emotional reaction would be a victory for them. It would prove I was exactly who they thought I was, sentimental, weak, and easily defeated. I would not give them the satisfaction. I placed my glass down and offered Hope my most gracious smile, the one I used for parents on conference night. "This pie is an old family recipe," I said, my voice even and warm. "Would you care for another slice, Hope? Or perhaps I could wrap some up for you to take home to Paige." The flicker of confusion in her eyes was more satisfying than a scream would ever have been. She stared at me, searching for the cracks in my composure, and found none. I had just been handed a death sentence, and I was offering her dessert. She didn't know what to do. She stammered a refusal, suddenly eager to leave. I walked her to the door, thanked her for coming, and watched her hurry to her car, her mission both accomplished and utterly failed. As her car disappeared down the street, I closed the front door, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality. I leaned my back against the solid wood, the mask of the gracious hostess finally falling away. I did not cry. The shock had burned away the tears, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. They had misjudged me. They saw a retired teacher, a quiet wife, a doting mother. They didn't see the woman who had managed unruly classrooms, stared down angry parents, and built a life from sheer grit and will. They had started a game without understanding the rules or their opponent. Some games require patience, and I've been patient a very long time. After Hope's car was gone, I stood with my back against the door for a full 5 minutes, listening to the house settle around me. The grandfather clock in the entryway chimed 2 o'clock, its deep, familiar tone marking the passage of time in a life I no longer recognized. Every object I looked at seemed to mock me. The framed photo on the console table Richard and I in Paris 20 years ago, his arm wrapped tightly around me, was a portrait of a stranger. The runner in the hallway, worn down the middle from decades of our footsteps, felt like a path leading to a lie. Hope's words had not just planted a seed of betrayal. They had detonated a bomb, and I was standing in the silent, ringing aftermath, surveying the wreckage of my own heart. My first instinct was to shatter something, to pick up the porcelain vase on the mantel and hurl it against the wall, to hear the crash, to see the pieces fly. My hands clenched, my nails digging into my palms. I wanted to scream until my throat was raw. I wanted to call Richard at his office and unleash a torrent of rage and pain so vicious it would strip the flesh from his bones. That is what they expected. A storm, an emotional cataclysm that would prove their narrative. I was the hysterical, unstable wife, and he was the poor, trapped husband who deserved his escape. But as the wave of fury crested, a colder, deeper current pulled it back. My 40 years in a classroom had taught me one invaluable lesson. The loudest person in the room is rarely the one in control. Control is quiet. It is deliberate. It is the steady, unwavering gaze that brings a chaotic room to silence. Paige and Richard had made their move loudly, clumsily, sending a herald to announce their intentions. They thought they were playing chess, but they had just tipped over the board and declared themselves winners. They had no idea I was the one who knew how all the pieces truly moved. My breathing slowed. The tremor in my hands subsided. I pushed myself off the door and walked, not to the phone, but to the kitchen. It was Thursday. For the last 38 years, Thursday was pot roast night. It was Richard's favorite meal, a recipe my own mother had taught me. The ritual of it, the slow browning of the meat, the methodical chopping of carrots and onions, the rich, savory aroma filling the house was a cornerstone of our life together. To abandon that ritual now would be to signal that something was broken. It would be an admission of defeat, and I was not defeated. I was at war. I took the heavy Dutch oven from its hook, the weight of it familiar and grounding in my hands. I laid out the ingredients on the butcher block counter, the marbled chuck roast, the ruddy potatoes, the bright orange carrots, the tear-inducing onions. Each one was a component in a performance. The kitchen was my stage, and I was preparing the set for the evening's lead actor. As I peeled the potatoes, the repetitive motion of the blade against the rough skin soothed the turmoil inside me. I was not the grieving wife. I was a strategist. Hope's visit was not just an insult, it was intelligence. It told me everything I needed to know about their plan, their timeline, and most importantly, their arrogance. They believed I was a passive participant in my own life, a problem to be managed and discarded. They had underestimated me so profoundly, it was almost beautiful in its ignorance. I seared the roast, the sizzle and spit of the fat, a sharp, angry sound in the quiet kitchen. They wanted the house, this house, the one I had filled with light and laughter, the one where I had nursed Richard through a vicious bout of pneumonia, holding his hand through the fevered nights, the house where our son Michael had taken his first steps, his tiny hand gripping my finger. They weren't just trying to take property. They were trying to erase my history, to bulldoze the foundation of my identity and build their tawdry future on the rubble. The scent of browning meat and onions filled the air, a warm, comforting lie. By the time I slid the heavy pot into the oven, the mask was firmly in place. I was Caroline Moore, devoted wife, preparing her husband's favorite meal. I was a portrait of domestic tranquility. No one looking at me would see the glacial fury solidifying in my soul. No one would guess that every chop of the knife, every stir of the spoon, was a silent vow of retribution. At 6:30, I heard the familiar sound of his BMW pulling into the driveway, the crunch of tires on gravel, the electronic beep as he locked the doors, the jingle of his keys at the lock. Sounds that had once meant safety and homecoming now sounded like an approaching threat. I smoothed my apron, took a deep breath, and composed my face into a pleasant, welcoming smile. He walked in, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was sharp, citrusy, with an undercurrent of something musky and expensive. It was not his scent. His scent was the clean, subtle fragrance of the Irish spring soap he'd used for 30 years and the faint, woodsy smell of his aftershave. This new cologne was an announcement. It was the scent of a man trying to be someone new, someone younger. It was the scent of Paige. It clung to him like a shroud, an invisible stain I could smell from across the room. "Smells great in here, honey," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful. He dropped his briefcase by the door and walked over to kiss my cheek. His lips were dry and brief, a perfunctory gesture devoid of warmth. He did not look me in the eye. His gaze slid past my face, landing somewhere over my shoulder. "Pot roast," I said, my voice perfectly even. "I know it's your favorite." "Always is," he replied, already turning away, pulling his phone from his pocket. The screen lit up, casting a pale, bluish glow on his face, a face that suddenly looked alien to me. His thumbs began to move, a quick, nervous tap dance on the glass. A small smile touched his lips, a secret, intimate thing that was not meant for me. I watched him. I did not ask who he was texting. I did not ask about the new cologne. I did not demand to know why his eyes wouldn't meet mine. Confrontation was a short, messy battle. I was planning a long, methodical campaign. So I watched, and I gathered my ammunition. I noted the way he angled his body away from me, instinctively shielding the screen. I saw the quick, furtive glances he cast in my direction to see if I was looking. He was a terrible spy, clumsy and obvious, made bold by the assumption that I was oblivious. At the dinner table, the performance continued. The pot roast was perfect, tender and falling apart. The gravy was rich. He praised it, of course, but his attention was elsewhere. His phone sat on the table beside his plate, face down, but every few minutes it would vibrate softly, a muted buzz against the oak table. Each buzz was a punctuation mark in their secret conversation, a reminder that another woman was present in our dining room, a ghost at our feast. He would pick it up, murmuring, "Just a work thing," before tapping out a quick reply. His eyes, when they did briefly meet mine, were flat and distant. They were the eyes of a man already gone, a man just waiting for the right moment to walk out the door for good. We talked about nothing. We talked about the weather, about a problem with the city council, about the neighbor's new dog. The conversation was a thin, fragile skin stretched over a gaping chasm of unspoken truths. I played my part. I asked the appropriate questions. I nodded. I smiled. I refilled his glass of water. I was the perfect, boring, predictable wife, and with every passing moment of my flawless performance, I could feel his relief growing. He was getting away with it. She was making it easy. He cleared his throat, pushing a stray carrot around his plate. "You know, Carol," he began, using the shortened version of my name he only used when he was nervous. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About the future, about happiness." Here it comes, I thought. The opening salvo, the clumsy, cliché-ridden speech about finding himself. I looked at him, my expression one of mild, wifely interest. "Oh? What about it?" He faltered, surprised by my placid response. He had expected me to sense the shift, to get anxious, to ask what was wrong. My calm threw him off script. Well, just that it's important, for both of us, to be happy. I laid my fork down. I agree, Richard. It is. His relief was palpable. It washed over his face, softening the tense lines around his mouth. He thought this was my surrender, my quiet acceptance of the inevitable. He saw my composure not as strength, but as resignation. He had no idea that beneath the calm surface of the lake, a leviathan was stirring. He had no idea that my mind was a whirlwind of strategy, that I was already mapping out his downfall, that his casual, cruel dismissal of our life together was fueling a resolve as hard and as cold as diamond. He finished his meal, excused himself to take a call, and disappeared into his study, closing the door behind him. I sat alone at the dining table, the remnants of his favorite meal growing cold on his plate. The house was silent again, save for the ticking of the clock. They had made their move, confident in their power, in my weakness. They had started a game of their own invention, with rules designed for them to win. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. I was a teacher. I had spent a lifetime studying my subjects, learning their weaknesses, their vanities, their blind spots. And Richard was a subject I had studied for 38 years. I knew his every tell, his every flaw, his every pressure point. They saw an old, boring woman. They were about to learn what it meant to face an opponent who knew them better than they knew themselves. If they want to play, they don't know their opponent. The 3 days between that hollow Thursday pot roast and Sunday dinner were a masterclass in self-control. I moved through my home, a ghost in my own life, touching the surfaces of a marriage that was already dead. I spoke to Richard in measured, pleasant tones. I slept soundly, or at least I feigned it, lying perfectly still on my side of the bed, my back a rigid wall between us. I did not check his phone. I did not search his pockets. I did not give him the satisfaction of suspicion. I was the placid lake, serene and undisturbed, while beneath the surface, the gears of my mind were grinding, calculating, and preparing for the next phase of the charade. Sunday arrived cloaked in a brilliant, deceptive Texas sunlight. I spent the morning preparing a lemon herb roasted chicken, another of Richard's favorites, the scent of rosemary and citrus filling the kitchen. It was all part of the performance. The dutiful wife, the welcoming mother-in-law, setting the stage for the family gathering that was, in reality, a battlefield. As I set the table with my grandmother's wedding china, the delicate plates with the gold filigree trim, I felt a pang, not of sadness, but of a cold, protective fury. Paige wanted this. She wanted to sit at this table, eat off these plates, and one day call them her own, over my dead body. The thought was not an exaggeration. It was a promise. At precisely 1 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Richard, who had been fidgeting in the living room, practically jumped to answer it, his eagerness a pathetic neon sign of his guilt. I took a moment, smoothing the front of my simple linen dress, and walked into the entryway just as he swung the door open, and there she was, Paige. A vision of predatory glamour. She wasn't dressed for a casual family dinner. She was dressed for an acquisition. She wore a cream-colored sheath dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment used to, paired with knife-sharp heels and a handbag that bore the interlocking gold initials of a French designer. Her blonde hair was a sleek, perfect curtain around a face of practiced sweetness. Her smile was dazzling. It was also a lie. "Caroline, you look wonderful," she chirped, gliding past Richard to embrace me. Her hug was brief, air-filled, her expensive perfume enveloping me in the same scent I'd smelled on my husband 3 nights before. It was a flagrant, deliberate marking of her territory. She was not just sleeping with my husband, she was wearing his scent into my home. "Hello, Paige," I said, my voice warm and steady as I gently disengaged. "Michael, it's so good to see you." My son, my dear oblivious Michael, followed her in, his face beaming with uncomplicated love for his wife. He gave me a real hug, strong and genuine. And for a fleeting, painful second, my resolve wavered. He was the collateral damage in this war, the innocent bystander on the verge of being caught in a brutal crossfire. The sight of his trusting smile, so easily offered to the viper at his side, solidified my purpose. I was not just fighting for myself. I was fighting for him, even if he didn't know it. "The house smells incredible, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek. Paige's eyes swept the room, her gaze lingering on the oil paintings in the hall, the antique grandfather clock, the Persian runner. It was not the look of an admirer. It was the look of an appraiser. "Oh, it always does," she cooed, slipping her arm through Richard's. I saw his body stiffen for a microsecond before relaxing into her touch. "Caroline, you've made this house such a perfect home. So warm, so established." The compliment was a dagger wrapped in silk. Established. A polite word for old, for stagnant. It was a verbal continuation of her sister's message. "You are the past. I am the future." We moved into the living room for drinks, and the performance began in earnest. Paige was the perfect daughter-in-law, asking all the right questions, laughing at all the right moments. She artfully positioned herself on the sofa next to Richard, their knees almost touching, creating a small, intimate island of two. Michael, bless his heart, sat in the armchair opposite them, completely missing the invisible lines of energy crackling between his wife and his father. I sat quietly, watching, sipping my iced tea. I was a spectator in my own life, collecting data points. The way Paige's hand brushed Richard's arm as she reached for a coaster. The shared, fleeting glance between them when Michael told a long, rambling story about a project at work. The way Richard's posture shifted, leaning ever so slightly toward her, like a plant tilting toward its only source of light. Each one was a small, damning piece of evidence, and I filed them all away in the cold, orderly archive of my mind. At the dinner table, she escalated her campaign. She praised the chicken, the roasted potatoes, the china, the silverware. Every compliment was a subtle assertion of her own superior taste, her own impending ownership. "This china is just exquisite, Caroline," she said, tracing the gold rim of her plate with a perfectly manicured finger. "It's so important to have things that last, things with history. But sometimes you just have to be willing to let go of history to make room for happiness, don't you think?" Her eyes, bright and insincere, met mine across the table. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearing his throat. Michael, ever the peacemaker, chimed in. "Well, these plates are staying right here. They're heirlooms." Paige smiled sweetly at her husband. "Of course, darling. I just mean in a more metaphorical sense. I was reading about a life coach who said that real happiness often requires a radical change, a fresh start. Sometimes you have to burn the old maps." Her gaze flickered to Richard, a quick, meaningful dart of her eyes. He gave a barely perceptible nod, his attention suddenly fixed on cutting a piece of chicken. I continued eating, my movements calm and deliberate. "That's a very modern perspective, Paige," I said politely. "Oh, I think it's timeless," she insisted. "I have a friend who just left her husband of 30 years. Everyone thought she was crazy, but now she's living in a gorgeous condo overlooking the ocean in Florida, dating a yoga instructor, and she's never looked better. She just needed to escape, to find somewhere warm." She sighed, a theatrical, wistful sound. "Imagine that, just escaping somewhere warm, leaving all the complications behind." The message was as subtle as a sledgehammer. Florida, a condo, leaving complications behind. She was narrating her own future, our future, right here at my dining room table. She was so confident, so drunk on her own power that she couldn't see the danger. She saw my silence as weakness, my politeness as surrender. She mistook my composure for ignorance. I watched her talk, her hands gesturing animatedly, the diamonds on her wedding ring, a ring I helped Michael pick out, catching the light. She was performing for an audience of one, Richard. She was showing him the vibrant, exciting life he could have with her, a stark contrast to the quiet, established life he had with me. And he was drinking it in, his eyes full of a pathetic, middle-aged yearning. The conversation eventually turned to Michael's work, and under the cover of a technical discussion about software development, Paige leaned slightly toward me. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know, Caroline, all I really want is for everyone I care about to be happy. Truly happy." She glanced at Richard, then back at me, her eyes wide with manufactured sincerity. "Life is too short to be stuck in a situation that isn't fulfilling anymore. You, of all people, deserve to be happy." It was the final, patronizing blow. The young, beautiful usurper giving the old, boring wife permission to be happy without the husband she was actively stealing. It was breathtaking in its audacity. This was the moment they had been waiting for. My reaction, the tears, the accusations, the messy emotional scene that would justify everything. I put down my fork and met her gaze directly. I let a slow, thoughtful smile spread across my lips, the kind of smile a teacher gives a precocious but misguided student. The air thickened with anticipation. Richard froze, his wine glass halfway to his mouth. Even Michael seemed to sense the shift, his voice trailing off. I held her gaze for a long moment, letting her see nothing but serene, unshakable calm. Then I leaned forward just slightly, my voice as soft and sweet as hers. "How considerate of you to say so, Paige." My smile, held in place by sheer, unadulterated will, did not waver until the sound of their car faded down the street. The moment the silence of the house reclaimed me, it fell from my face like a shattered mask. I stood in the entryway, my hand resting on the cool wood of the grandfather clock, its steady, rhythmic ticking a counterpoint to the frantic, hammering pulse in my wrists. "How considerate of you to say so, Paige." The words echoed in the quiet hall, my own voice sounding alien, a creature of ice and control I was only just beginning to know. They had been so sure of themselves, Paige with her patronizing sympathy, and Richard with his cowardly, complicit silence. They had laid their cards on my dining room table, confident I held a losing hand. They saw my placid exterior and assumed it was a reflection of a placid soul, a woman too tired, too conventional, too boring to fight back. They had mistaken patience for passivity. It was a fatal error. I did not spend the rest of the day in mourning. The time for grief was over, cauterized by the sheer, breathtaking audacity of their performance. Instead, I moved with a new, chilling purpose. I cleared the table, scraping the remains of the meal they had eaten in my home into the trash. I washed my grandmother's china by hand, each plate and cup handled with a reverent care that was a silent promise they would never belong to her. As I worked, my mind was not on the past, but on the future. The pain was still there, a deep, tectonic ache in my chest, but it was no longer a paralyzing force. It was fuel. It was the engine driving me toward a destination they could not possibly foresee. The next morning, I did not put on my usual gardening clothes or plan my week around errands. I dressed in a charcoal gray suit I hadn't worn in years, a relic from a time before I had allowed my identity to be fully subsumed by the roles of wife and mother. I put on low, sensible heels. My hands were steady as I applied a touch of lipstick. Looking in the mirror, I saw not the wounded wife of yesterday, but a woman I vaguely recognized, Caroline Moore, the meticulous, organized, and deeply underestimated teacher who never lost control of her classroom. I drove downtown, away from the sprawling, tree-lined streets of our suburban life, and toward the sharp, steel and glass heart of Austin. The high-rise building where I had my appointment scraped the sky, a monument to power and commerce. This was not my world, but I walked into the lobby without hesitation. My appointment was at 10. The offices of Harrison & Cole LLP were on the 40th floor. The elevator ride was silent and swift, a smooth upward trajectory that felt symbolic. When the doors opened, I was met with cool air, gleaming marble floors, and a panoramic view of the Texas state capitol. The atmosphere was one of quiet, formidable competence. This was a place where battles were won not with emotional outbursts, but with meticulously documented facts and ironclad legal strategy. A receptionist directed me to a corner office. The name on the door was Patricia Harris. She rose from behind a vast minimalist desk as I entered. She was perhaps a decade younger than me, with sharp, intelligent eyes, hair pulled back in a severe chignon, and an air of professional ferocity that was as intimidating as it was reassuring. She did not offer sympathy. She offered a firm handshake. "Mrs. Moore," she said, her voice crisp and direct, "please have a seat. You said on the phone this was a matter of some urgency." I sat in the leather chair opposite her, the city of Austin sprawling out behind her like a conquered map. There was no preamble, no emotional outpouring. I had rehearsed this. I laid out the facts as clearly and concisely as if I were presenting a lesson plan. "My husband, Richard Moore, is having an affair with my son's wife, Paige Carter," I began, my voice even. "I was informed this past week that their intention is to proceed with a divorce. They have a legal strategy in place to ensure Paige and Richard retain the primary assets of the marriage, including our family home." Patricia listened, her expression unreadable. She made a few notes on a legal pad, her pen scratching softly in the quiet room. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she looked up, her gaze analytical. "And your husband believes you are unaware of this affair and their subsequent plans?" she asked. "He believes I am, at worst, vaguely unhappy," I replied. "He has no idea that I know the specifics. They believe I am preparing to be a willing victim." A flicker of something not pity, but professional interest crossed her face. "Good," she said simply. "That gives us the single greatest advantage we can have. Surprise. Let's review the assets. I'll need to see everything. Deeds, account statements, investment portfolios, tax returns for the last 10 years. For the next 2 hours, we worked. I had brought a briefcase filled with every financial document I could find. We spread them across her desk, the story of my 38-year marriage reduced to a series of numbers on a page, and the picture that emerged was grim. The house in Westlake, which I had considered the bedrock of my life, was titled in both our names. His business, a successful consulting firm, was structured to be almost entirely his. The majority of our liquid assets were in investment accounts to which he had primary access, and a quick review showed a pattern of large recent withdrawals he had explained away as market reinvestments. Patricia's assessment was blunt. "On the surface, Caroline, your position is precarious. They've structured this to look like a standard, albeit inequitable, dissolution. His lawyer, and you can be sure Paige has one of the most ruthless ones in Dallas, will argue that the business is his. The house is a shared asset to be divided, and your contributions as a homemaker entitle you to a modest alimony. They will bleed you dry with legal fees and paint you as a bitter, older woman out of touch with financial realities." A cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. It was exactly as Paige's sister had laid it out. They had planned this meticulously. They had been building this cage around me for years, and I had been too trusting to see the bars. My hands were resting on the stack of documents, and my fingers brushed against a thick vellum envelope at the bottom of the pile. It was old, the paper softened with age. I had almost forgotten it was there. "There is one more thing," I said, my voice quiet. "I don't know if it's relevant. It's a family trust. It was set up by my grandfather when I was a child. The assets in it were used as the down payment on our house and to fund the seed money for Richard's business decades ago. I've never paid much attention to it." I pushed the envelope across the desk. Patricia picked it up, her movements careful. She slid out the thick folded document. The script was elaborate, the language formal and archaic. She began to read, her eyes scanning the pages with increasing focus. The silence in the room stretched on. The only sound was the faint whisper of the old paper as she turned a page. Suddenly, she stopped. She went back, rereading a paragraph, her finger tracing the dense lines of text. A slow, sharp smile touched her lips. It was the smile of a predator that has just caught the scent of blood. "Oh my," she breathed, looking up at me. Her eyes were alight with a fierce, brilliant energy. "Caroline, your grandfather was a very, very smart man, and he did not trust easily." She turned the document around so I could see it. "This is an irrevocable trust, tied to your bloodline. The assets and anything purchased with those assets are designated as your sole and separate property, intended to benefit you and your direct descendants. Richard is a beneficiary only by marriage. She then tapped a specific paragraph midway down the page. But this is the masterstroke. Your grandfather included two very specific, very unusual clauses for his time. She read the first one aloud. Clause A, the bloodline proviso. All properties, businesses, or significant assets acquired using the principal or interest from this trust shall remain legally tethered to the trust itself as extensions of the original bloodline inheritance. She looked at me. The down payment on your house and the seed money for his business came from this trust, correct? I nodded, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. Yes, both. Which means, she said, her voice dropping with dramatic weight, that legally, this trust has a controlling interest in both your home and his company. They are not marital assets in the traditional sense. They are assets of the trust. She let that sink in before pointing to the next paragraph. And then there is this, Clause B, the morality covenant. She cleared her throat and read the damning words. In the event of a marital dissolution resulting directly from a proven act of infidelity on the part of the spousal beneficiary, all rights, claims, and access of said spousal beneficiary to any and all assets connected to this trust are immediately and irrevocably rendered null and void. Full ownership and control shall revert entirely to the primary bloodline beneficiary. I stared at her, the archaic legal language slowly coalescing into a single, stunning reality. I read the words again for myself. Proven act of infidelity, rights, rendered null and void, full ownership, shall revert entirely. The fear that had been lodged in my chest for days dissolved, replaced by a wave of cold, crystalline clarity. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't joy. It was the sudden, shocking realization that I had been holding the winning card the entire time and never even knew it. My grandfather, a man who died when I was 20, had reached across 50 years of time to protect me. He had seen a future I could never have imagined and had built me a fortress. Patricia leaned back in her chair, a look of profound, professional satisfaction on her face. "They are planning to take your house," she said softly. "But the truth is, Caroline, it has never, ever been theirs to take. The same goes for the business he built using your family's money." I looked out the window at the city stretching to the horizon. It looked different now, sharper, clearer. The path ahead, which had been a terrifying, murky fog, was now a straight, illuminated line. I finally looked back at Patricia. The mask of the grieving wife was gone forever. In its place was the cool, calm composure of a woman who finally understood the rules of the game. "They are playing checkers," I said, my voice low and steady. "They don't even know all the pieces on the board." Leaving Patricia Harris's office was like stepping out of a pressurized cabin into the open air. The weight that had been crushing my chest for what felt like an eternity had lifted, replaced by a strange, buoyant calm. The trust document, now safely copied and stored, was more than a legal instrument. It was an anchor, a connection to a past that had foreseen this treacherous future and provided me with a shield. My grandfather, a stern, quiet man I barely remembered, had become my silent, formidable ally. The knowledge of his foresight, of his quiet, protective love, was a balm to my wounded spirit. I did not drive straight home. Instead, I went to a small cafe downtown, a place Richard had never been, and ordered a cup of black coffee. I needed a moment to recalibrate, to absorb the seismic shift that had just occurred. The battle I had been bracing for a desperate defensive scrap, for a sliver of the life I had built, was over before it had even begun. I was not the defendant in this case. I was the plaintiff, the judge, and the jury, all rolled into one. I held the power. The only question now was how to wield it. My first instinct, a hot primitive urge, was to confront them. to walk into my house, slap the trust document down on the kitchen island in front of Richard, and watch the smug confidence drain from his face. I pictured the scene with a vicious, satisfying clarity. His shock, his denial, followed by the dawning, panicked horror as he realized the sheer magnitude of his miscalculation. I imagined calling Paige, her voice dripping with false sympathy, and calmly informing her that the house she was plotting to steal was, and always had been, mine. That the lifestyle she so craved, funded by the business my family's money had built, was about to be cut off at the source. The fantasy was intoxicating. It was the righteous, cinematic climax I felt I deserved. But as I sat there, stirring my coffee, the image faded, replaced by the cool, strategic logic that had become my new compass. Patricia's parting words echoed in my mind. "The surprise is our greatest advantage. Let them continue to believe they are in control. Let them expose their greed, their intentions, their entire strategy. Let them build their case on a foundation of sand. We will not correct them. We will simply let them fall." An open confrontation would be messy. It would give them time to regroup, to find some obscure legal loophole, to spin a narrative of me as a manipulative, vindictive woman hiding assets. It would drag my son, Michael, into the heart of the storm prematurely, forcing him to choose sides before he even understood the war he was caught in. No. A swift, satisfying strike was emotionally gratifying, but a slow, methodical unraveling was strategically superior. They had wanted to play a long game of manipulation. I would play a longer one. I finished my coffee and drove home. The house no longer felt like enemy territory. When I walked through the front door, I saw it not as something I was about to lose, but as something I was about to reclaim. The furniture, the art, the very light slanting through the windows, it all belonged to me, tethered to my bloodline by a covenant written half a century ago. A profound and quiet sense of ownership settled over me. I was not a guest in my own home, waiting to be evicted. I was the warden, and the inmates just didn't know it yet. That evening, when Richard came home, I was ready. The mask of the placid wife was back in place, but it was different now. It was no longer a shield born of fear and self-preservation. It was a lure. It was bait. He walked in, wearing the same air of strained cheerfulness, the same shroud of Paige's expensive cologne. He was carrying a bottle of wine, a Chardonnay I particularly liked. It was a clumsy, transparently guilty gesture. "Thought we could have a glass of wine tonight," he said, avoiding my eyes as he bustled into the kitchen. "Relax a little." "That's a lovely idea, Richard," I said, my voice soft and accommodating. As he fumbled with the corkscrew, his back to me, I began. I had rehearsed the words, the tone, the carefully placed pauses. "Richard," I said, my voice gentle, laced with a convincing melancholy. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since Sunday." He stilled, his hands ceasing their motion. I could see the tension in his shoulders. This was it. He was bracing for the tears, the accusations. "I've been thinking about what Paige said," I continued, a slight, believable tremble in my voice. "About happiness, about fresh starts." He turned around slowly, the corkscrew still in his hand. His face was a mask of cautious curiosity. "And?" he prompted, his voice wary. I looked down at my hands as if gathering my courage. "And maybe she's right." I finally lifted my eyes to meet his, making sure they were filled not with anger, but with a deep, weary sadness. "Maybe this, us, isn't working anymore. Maybe we've just run our course. Maybe it's time for both of us to find happiness, apart." The effect was instantaneous and profound. It was as if I had physically lifted a mountain from his shoulders. The cautious, tense lines on his face dissolved, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated relief. It was so potent, so visible, it was almost nauseating to watch. His entire body seemed to relax. He had been expecting a fight, a war of attrition. Instead, I had just handed him a flag of unconditional surrender. "Caroline, he stammered, momentarily speechless. He had a whole speech prepared, I was sure of it, full of tired cliches about growing apart and needing space. I had just rendered it completely unnecessary. "It's all right, Richard," I said, walking over and placing a gentle hand on his arm. I forced myself not to recoil at his touch. "We've had a good life together, a long life, but people change. We've changed. I don't want to be the person holding you back from what you really want." His eyes, for the first time in months, met mine with something resembling warmth, but it wasn't love. It was gratitude. The gratitude of a prisoner who has just been handed the key to his own cell by a warden who has inexplicably decided to set him free. I don't know what to say," he said, his voice thick with false emotion. This is incredibly gracious of you, Caroline. I want you to know that." "I just want us both to be happy," I repeated, the phrase now a carefully crafted mantra. I had turned Paige's weapon back on them. I was using their own narrative, their own saccharine language of self-fulfillment, to lull them into a state of absolute security. He finally managed to open the wine, his hands moving with a new, jaunty confidence. He poured 2 glasses, his movements expansive, liberated. He handed one to me and raised his own in a toast. To new beginnings," he said, his eyes shining. "To new beginnings," I echoed, touching my glass to his. The clink of the crystal was a sharp, clear sound in the quiet room. He drank his wine eagerly. I barely let the rim of the glass touch my lips. In that moment, he was no longer my husband. He was my opponent, and he had just fallen for the oldest trick in the book. He believed he was the victor, the one who had successfully manipulated the situation to his advantage. He saw my compliance not as a strategy, but as a validation of his own desirability, of Paige's irresistible allure, and of my inevitable decline. He saw me as a problem that had just solved itself. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. Now, all I had to do was wait for him to walk further in, to get so comfortable, so certain of his victory, that when the steel jaws finally snapped shut, he would never even see it coming. He thought he was toasting his freedom. In reality, he was toasting his own ruin. And I, his gracious, boring, predictable wife, stood beside him, smiling. The 2 weeks following my act of gracious surrender were a study in the art of deception. I performed the role of the soon-to-be ex-wife with an Oscar-worthy devotion. I was calm, cooperative, and heartbreakingly melancholic. I sighed wistfully while packing away a few of my books into boxes, a single well-placed tear tracing a path down my cheek when Richard accidentally walked in on me. I spoke of the future in vague but hopeful terms, mentioning the possibility of a quiet little condo, perhaps closer to the library. Every word, every gesture, was a carefully calibrated note in the symphony of my capitulation, and Richard conducted the orchestra with blissful ignorance. He, in turn, was a caricature of the liberated man. He was magnanimous, overly kind, treating me with the gentle, patronizing care one might afford a fragile, beloved aunt. He was generous with his praise for my understanding and my grace. His relief was so thick and cloying, I could almost taste it in the air between us. He and Paige were getting everything they wanted, and they were getting it without a fight. They were not just winning, they were winning cleanly, their consciences clear, their victory assured by my own willing participation. The sheer, unmitigated arrogance of it was a constant, simmering source of fuel for my resolve. Then came the call. It was Richard, his voice brisk and businesslike. His lawyer was ready. He had drafted a preliminary settlement agreement. He suggested we all meet in Dallas, on neutral ground. "My attorney's name is Bob Jensen," Richard explained, as if sharing a helpful tip. "He's a great guy. We play golf together. He's all about making this as painless and amicable as possible. He'll take good care of you, Carol." Take good care of me. The phrase was so condescending, so dismissive. I had to grip the edge of the counter to keep my hand from shaking. They were so confident in my passivity that they didn't even think I would bring my own legal counsel. They saw me as a lamb being led to a very civilized, well-appointed slaughter. "Of course, Richard," I said, my voice soft. "Whatever makes this easiest." I immediately called Patricia. Her response was a low, satisfied laugh. Dallas? A golf buddy? Oh, this is perfect. They're not just underestimating you, Caroline. They're not even trying. They're sloppy. Let's go to Dallas. The day of the meeting was overcast, the Texas sky a flat, washed-out gray that mirrored the cold composure I had wrapped around myself like a cloak. Richard drove. The 2-hour trip up I-35 was filled with an awkward, strained silence. He tried to make small talk, pointing out landmarks, but I responded in quiet monosyllables, perfecting the image of a woman lost in a fog of quiet grief. I was not grieving. I was memorizing the lines on his face, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, the confident set of his jaw. I was taking a final inventory of the man I thought I knew, before I erased him from my life completely. The law offices of Jensen and Associates were exactly what I expected, a shrine to masculine self-importance. The walls were paneled in dark, glossy wood and adorned with oil paintings of hunting dogs. The air smelled of leather, polish, and smug entitlement. We were shown into a conference room dominated by a massive mahogany table that gleamed under a brass chandelier. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows was of the Dallas skyline, a panorama of corporate power. Bob Jensen rose to greet us. He was a man in his late 50s, with a florid, sun-beaten face, a shock of silver hair, and the easy, backslapping demeanor of a man who has never been told no in his life. He shook Richard's hand warmly before turning to me, his smile oozing a predatory sympathy. "Caroline," he said, taking my hand in both of his. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Richard has told me so much about your grace and dignity through this difficult process. We're going to make this as smooth as possible for you." I simply nodded, allowing him to lead me to a chair. I sat, my back straight, my hands folded calmly on the table in front of me. I was the very picture of quiet compliance. Bob settled into his large leather chair at the head of the table, radiating an air of complete command. Richard sat to his right, looking confident and relaxed. They were a team, two old buddies about to wrap up a friendly game. I was the inconvenient but manageable final detail. "All right," Bob began, opening a sleek leather portfolio. "Let's get to it. We've drafted a settlement agreement that we feel is exceptionally fair and reflects Richard's desire to ensure you are well taken care of." He slid a thick document across the polished table toward me. I did not reach for it. I simply looked at him, my expression placid. He proceeded to outline the terms, his voice a smooth, reasonable drone. It was a masterpiece of legal larceny, dressed up in the language of amicable separation. Richard, he explained, would retain the business, Jensen and Associates having determined it was a non-marital asset due to his sole proprietorship and intellectual capital. Richard would also retain the entirety of his pension and the investment portfolios, as they were tied to the business's performance. "Now, regarding the primary residence in Westlake," Bob said, leaning forward conspiratorially, as if sharing a gentle, unavoidable truth, "our title search turned up some irregularities. The initial funding source is a bit murky, tied to an old family instrument of yours that is, frankly, legally ambiguous. To avoid a protracted and costly court battle to clarify title, Richard has generously agreed not to pursue you for costs. In exchange, the deed will be transferred solely to him." My blood ran cold, but my face remained a perfect, serene mask. Irregularities, murky, legally ambiguous. They had found the trust, and their high-priced lawyers had dismissed it, confident they could bully their way past my grandfather's fortress with jargon and intimidation. They had no idea it was an ironclad, irrevocable covenant. They saw an old document and assumed it was a relic, not a weapon. He wasn't finished. "In exchange for your full cooperation," he continued, his voice dripping with magnanimity, "Richard is prepared to offer you the deed to a lovely 2-bedroom condominium in North Austin. It's a very nice community, and of course, he will provide a minimal alimony for a transitional period of 24 months to help you get back on your feet." It was breathtaking. It was a complete and total robbery. They were taking my home, my business, my future, and offering me a pittance, a cage in a nice community to live out the rest of my days in quiet obscurity. They were not just divorcing me, they were erasing me. They were reducing 38 years of my life, my partnership, and my family's legacy to a 2-year handout. Bob Jensen finished his presentation and leaned back in his chair, a benevolent smile on his face. He folded his hands over his stomach, the picture of a man who had just solved a difficult but necessary problem with fairness and generosity. Richard looked at me, his eyes full of that same pathetic, pleading gratitude, silently begging me to accept my own annihilation with the grace he so admired. The silence in the room was heavy. They were waiting for my tears, my protests, my inevitable broken acceptance. This was the moment of my defeat. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I looked from Bob's smug, expectant face to Richard's nervous, hopeful one. I allowed the silence to stretch, to become uncomfortable. I watched the confidence in their eyes begin to waver, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Then I finally reached forward and pulled the thick document toward me. I did not read it. I didn't need to. I already knew its every poisoned word. I picked up the heavy, expensive fountain pen that lay beside it. I looked directly at Bob Jensen, my gaze clear and steady, and with a small, serene smile, I asked the question they never, in their wildest dreams, expected to hear. Where do I sign? The shock in the room was a physical force. It sucked the air out of the space. Bob Jensen's jaw literally dropped. He stared at me, his mouth agape, his carefully constructed scenario utterly shattered. Richard's face went pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had been prepared for a negotiation, for tears, for anything but this. Instant, unconditional surrender. It was too easy, and in that moment, for the first time, a sliver of doubt, a tiny, cold serpent of fear, began to uncoil in the back of their minds. They had just been handed the perfect victory. So why did it suddenly feel like a trap? Without another word, I flipped to the last page of the agreement, found the line for my signature, and signed my name. My handwriting was firm and clear, no tremor, no hesitation. I pushed the document back across the table. Their victory was signed, sealed, and delivered, and their ruin had just officially begun. The drive home from Dallas was a 4-act play performed in the suffocating confines of a luxury sedan. Act 1 was shock. Richard sat behind the wheel in stunned, absolute silence for the first 30 miles, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He kept glancing at me, his brow furrowed in utter bafflement, as if trying to solve a complex equation that kept yielding an impossible answer. He had walked into that room expecting a negotiation, a confrontation, a scene. He had received a signature. It was a victory so total, so effortless, that it defied all his expectations, leaving him suspended in a state of pure disbelief. Act 2 was a slow dawning relief. As the miles ticked by, the rigid set of his shoulders began to soften. His grip on the wheel relaxed. A small, almost imperceptible sigh escaped his lips. The impossible answer was, it seemed, correct. He had won. The grace and dignity he had so condescendingly praised had manifested as a complete and total abdication. I had simply given up. The relief began to flow through him, a warm, intoxicating current washing away the last vestiges of his guilt and anxiety. Act 3 was triumph. He started to hum, a low, tuneless sound deep in his chest. He turned on the radio, filling the car with upbeat, generic pop music. He began to talk, his voice laced with the expansive bonhomie of a man who has just successfully closed the deal of a lifetime. He spoke of the future, careful at first, but growing bolder with each mile. He talked about simplifying, downsizing, the importance of living an authentic life. He was no longer speaking to me but to himself, testing out the phrases, the justifications that he and Paige had likely rehearsed for months. He was crafting the narrative of his own blameless liberation. And I, in the passenger seat, performed my own one-act masterpiece, The Defeated Woman. I stared out the window, my expression mournfully blank. I offered one-word answers when prompted. I allowed my shoulders to slump. I was a portrait of quiet resignation, a woman so broken by the end of her life as she knew it, that she no longer had the strength to even question the terms of her own erasure. It was a flawless performance. Act 4, the final and most galling act, was pity. As we pulled into our driveway, my driveway, he turned to me, his face a mask of solemn, compassionate concern. He placed his hand over mine on the center console. "Caroline," he said, his voice low and sincere, "I want you to know, this is the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Your grace today, it means the world to me. I promise you, Bob and I will make sure the transition is seamless. You'll be taken care of." I met his gaze, my eyes conveying a deep, weary sadness. I gave a slow, defeated nod and squeezed his hand weakly. "Thank you, Richard." I removed my hand from under his, opened the car door, and walked into my house, leaving him to bask in the warm glow of his bloodless, triumphant coup. That night, he went out. He said he was meeting a client for a celebratory dinner. He came home just after midnight, humming again, his clothes saturated with the cloying sweetness of champagne and the sharp floral notes of Paige's perfume. They had been celebrating their victory, celebrating the acquisition of my home, my life, my future. I lay in bed, feigning sleep, and listened to him move around the bedroom, his movements light and carefree. He believed the war was over. He had no idea that my signature had been the opening shot. The next morning, I was back in Patricia Harris's office on the 40th floor. The gray, overcast sky from the day before had been replaced by a brilliant, cloudless blue. I placed my copy of the signed settlement agreement on her gleaming desk. She picked it up, her expression one of deep professional admiration. "Masterful, Caroline," she said, her voice a low hum of satisfaction. "Absolutely masterful. I spoke to Bob Jensen's assistant this morning to confirm they are filing the divorce petition today. They are feeling very, very pleased with themselves." "They believe they've won," I stated. "They believe they've executed one of the most lopsided, advantageous settlements in Dallas County history with zero resistance," she corrected me. "And in doing so, they have handed us our entire case on a silver platter. This document," she tapped the settlement agreement with a perfectly manicured nail, "is no longer a proposal. It is a signed confession. It is a detailed, legally binding record of their greed. They have in writing outlined their entire strategy to defraud you of assets that, unbeknownst to them, are legally and irrevocably yours. We could not have drafted a better piece of evidence if we tried." She leaned forward, her sharp eyes gleaming. "And now, Caroline, our greatest ally comes into play, the state of Texas." She explained it to me then. In Texas, there is a mandatory 60-day waiting period between the date a divorce petition is filed and the date a judge can sign the final decree. It's often called a cooling-off period, a legal pause designed to give couples a chance to reconcile. "But we will not be using it to cool off," Patricia said, a predatory smile touching her lips. "We will be using it to prepare. For the next 59 days, Richard and Paige will be living in a fool's paradise. They will be making plans. They will be spending money. They will be redecorating your house in their minds. They will be taking victory laps. They will believe this signed agreement is an inevitability, just waiting for a judge's rubber stamp." "And what will we be doing?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We," she said, her voice dropping, "will be assembling an arsenal. My team is already at work. We have a forensic accountant performing a deep dive into Richard's business finances and personal accounts, tracing every dollar he has pulled out over the last year. We have a private investigator who will be providing us with irrefutable photographic proof of the affair, the proven act of infidelity your grandfather's trust so wisely requires." We will be getting a quiet, independent appraisal of the Westlake house and all its contents. We will be preparing the motion to invalidate this fraudulent settlement. We will be drafting the countersuit to enforce the morality clause of the trust. We will build a case so airtight, so overwhelming, that when we present it, they will not have a single legal leg to stand on. The 60-day waiting period was not a pause. It was a countdown. It was a gift of time, a procedural grace period that I would use to orchestrate their downfall. Time, which I had thought was my enemy, the relentless force pushing me toward irrelevance and old age, was now my most powerful weapon. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. I was living a double existence. At home, I was the picture of gentle melancholy. I began to pack boxes, filling them with old photo albums and books, my movements slow and deliberate. Richard would watch me, his expression a mixture of pity and relief. He was kind, helpful even, offering to carry heavy boxes, his generosity a constant grating reminder of his guilt. Meanwhile, he and Paige grew bolder. Travel brochures for the Florida Keys appeared on the coffee table. Swatches of paint colors I had never seen before were left on the kitchen counter. I overheard him on the phone with her, his voice low but excited, discussing knocking down the wall between the kitchen and the dining room to create a more open concept space. They were redesigning my life before I had even vacated it. Each overheard conversation, each carelessly left brochure, was another log on the fire of my cold, patient rage. My other life was lived in the quiet, air-conditioned competence of Patricia's office. There, I was not a victim. I was a general, planning a campaign. I reviewed the reports from the forensic accountant, which detailed the thousands of dollars Richard had siphoned into a secret account. I examined the photographs from the private investigator Clear, damning images of Richard and Paige kissing outside a boutique hotel, their expressions unguarded, their betrayal undeniable. With each new piece of evidence, the case grew stronger, a legal fortress rising stone by stone around my grandfather's original foundation. We were not just preparing to fight, we were preparing to annihilate. One evening, about a month into the countdown, I was in the study, packing books. Richard walked in and stood in the doorway watching me. "You've handled this all so well, Carol," he said softly. "Better than I ever could have imagined." I paused, a dusty copy of Pride and Prejudice in my hand. I looked at him, my expression carefully neutral. "There's no sense in fighting the inevitable, Richard." "No," he agreed, a satisfied smile on his face. "There isn't." He had no idea how right he was. He saw my packed boxes as a sign of my departure. He didn't realize they were a symbol of his. He thought he was watching me dismantle my life. He was, in fact, witnessing the assembly of his own destruction. The clock was ticking, each second a silent step toward his reckoning. The calendar on my kitchen wall, with its serene pictures of English gardens, had become my war map. Each day I crossed off was another mile marker on their road to ruin. They had wanted a new beginning. I was going to give them one. In exactly 60 days, their world, the one they thought they had so cleverly stolen, would cease to exist. Throughout the agonizing 60-day countdown, the heaviest burden on my heart was Michael, my son. He moved through the world wrapped in a blanket of blissful ignorance, woven by the two people he trusted most, his wife and his father. Every phone call with him was a masterpiece of maternal restraint. He would talk about his work, about a new project he was excited about Paige's latest social triumph. He would ask how I was doing, his voice filled with genuine, uncomplicated love, and I would have to swallow the truth that was a constant, bitter taste in my mouth. "I'm fine, honey," I'd say, my voice steady, just adjusting. "I know it's a big change, Mom," he would reply, his sympathy pure. "But Dad seems happier, and Paige says you've been amazing through all this. She says you're both handling it with so much class." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. Paige, the architect of his coming heartbreak, was reporting back to him on my class, using his love for me as a tool to manage him, to keep him placid and unsuspecting. Every word of his was a fresh twist of the knife, a reminder of the innocence I was allowing to be shattered. I had my reasons to protect the strategic advantage, to ensure the outcome was absolute, but the guilt was a constant low-grade fever. Patricia had warned me that for the plan to work, Michael had to remain in the dark until the last possible moment. If he confronted them prematurely, they would know I was behind it, and the trap would spring shut on empty air. So I waited, and with every passing day, the silence felt more and more like a betrayal of my own son. The catalyst came from the most unexpected of sources: Hope. Paige's sister, the woman who had delivered the initial declaration of war, had her own complex web of resentments. She had been used as a pawn, and it had not sat well with her. A week before the 60-day clock was set to expire, she made her move. She didn't call me. She called Michael. I found out when he showed up at my door on a Tuesday night. It wasn't his usual visiting day, and the moment I saw his face, I knew. The blanket of ignorance had been ripped away, and he was standing in the cold, harsh wind of reality. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and a terrible, dawning horror. He looked like a little boy again, the one who had run to me after falling off his bike, his face scraped and his world shaken. "Mom," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He walked past me into the living room and sank onto the sofa, his body moving as if a crucial part of his skeleton had been removed. He was holding his phone in his hand, gripping it like it was both a weapon and a wound. "Hope called me," he said, not looking at me. He was staring at the blank television screen, his gaze unfocused. "She told me to look at the cloud account, the family account that Paige set up for photos. She said there was a folder I needed to see. A folder she said Dad accidentally synced from his phone." He fell silent. I sat down in the armchair opposite him, my hands clasped in my lap, my heart aching with a pain that was entirely for him. I said nothing. This was his story to tell, his discovery to process. It was all there, Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Hundreds of them. Texts, messages between her and Dad. Going back months, years." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were swimming with a pain and betrayal so profound it took my breath away. "They talked about everything. About his money, about the business, about you." He swallowed hard. "They called you the obstacle. They talked about how to manage you. Paige had a timeline, when to bring it up, how to frame it, how to make sure you didn't make a fuss." He let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "She told him I would be easy to handle. She said I was too devoted to her to ever question anything. She called me sweet, but simple." The cruelty of it was staggering, not just the affair, but the cold, calculated contempt they held for him, for his love, for his trust. They had seen his goodness not as a virtue, but as a weakness to be exploited. "I didn't believe it at first," he continued, his voice growing stronger, harder. "I thought it was a mistake, a prank. So I went home. I confronted her." He looked down at his phone again, his thumb scrolling through the screen. "She didn't even deny it, Mom. She laughed." He looked up at me again, his face a mask of shattered illusion. "She told me to grow up. She said she and Dad had a real connection, something I could never understand. She said the settlement was signed and the house was theirs. She told me I could either get on board with my new life or get out of the way. And then she showed me this." He turned the phone toward me. It was a photo of the signed settlement agreement, my signature, clear and firm, at the bottom. To him, it was not a strategic move. It was the ultimate proof of my surrender, of his mother's defeat. It was the seal on his new, horrific reality. "Why, Mom?" he asked, his voice breaking completely. "Why did you just give them everything? Why didn't you fight?" The moment had come. The secret I had carried for 2 agonizing months could finally be brought into the light. I leaned forward, my voice low and steady, a calm anchor in his raging storm. "Because, Michael," I said gently, "sometimes, to win the war, you have to let them think they've won the first battle. Sometimes you let people reveal who they really are." And then I told him everything. I started with Hope's visit, the pecan pie, and the cold, calculated threat. I told him about the pot roast, the new cologne, and the Sunday dinner performance. I told him about my visit to Patricia Harris, about the gleaming office on the 40th floor, and then I told him about his great-grandfather, a man he'd never met, and the fortress he had built for us a lifetime ago. I explained the trust, the bloodline clause, and I explained the morality covenant. As I spoke, the look on Michael's face shifted. The wounded, betrayed confusion was slowly replaced by a dawning, incredulous understanding. The color began to return to his cheeks. The slump in his shoulders straightened. He was seeing the full picture for the first time, not as a victim of a tawdry affair, but as a witness to a meticulously planned counteroffensive. My signature on that document was no longer an act of surrender. It was an act of war. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. He just stared at me, a million emotions flickering in his eyes, shock, anger, and a fierce, burgeoning pride. "All this time," he said finally, his voice full of awe, "you've been playing them. All this time, while they were celebrating, you were building a case." "We were," I corrected him gently. "And now, you're a part of it." A new kind of anger began to burn in his eyes. But this was different. It was not the helpless rage of a victim. It was the focused, cold fury of a man who had been profoundly wronged and was now being handed a weapon. "Sweet, but simple," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "She has no idea who she's dealing with. Neither of them do." That night, for the first time in months, we were not a broken family. We were a team, mother and son, united by betrayal, but now forged in a shared, unshakable purpose. The illusion was shattered, but in its place, something stronger was being built. He saw me not as his fragile, defeated mother, but as the strategist I had become. And I saw him not as my sweet, oblivious son, but as the strong, honorable man I had always known him to be, finally awakened to the truth. The pain was still there, a deep and terrible wound, but now it was tempered with resolve. They thought they had broken us apart. Instead, they had just given us our rallying cry. The 60-day clock was almost out of time, and we were ready. The transformation in Michael was as swift as it was absolute. The wounded, heartbroken man who had collapsed on my sofa was gone. In his place was a man forged in the fires of a betrayal so profound it had burned away every last trace of his naivete. The son I had raised to be kind and trusting had been replaced by an ally whose focus was as sharp and as cold as a shard of glass. His pain had not vanished. It had simply metastasized into a quiet, chilling rage that was now entirely directed at the two people who had so casually shattered his world. "I'm going back to the house," he told me the next morning, his voice devoid of emotion. We were in my kitchen, a place that now felt like a war room, sipping coffee as the sun rose. "She thinks I've gone to stay with a friend to cool off. She's not expecting me back until tonight." "Michael, what are you planning?" I asked, a knot of apprehension tightening in my stomach. "I'm looking," he said simply. "Hope told me where to find the texts. If they were that sloppy, that arrogant, what else did they leave lying around?" "Paige is a planner, Mom. I've lived with her for 8 years. She has contingency plans for her contingency plans. She documents everything: wills, insurance policies, bank statements. She keeps it all in a small fireproof safe in the back of our closet." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "She always said it was for emergencies. I'm starting to think this is the emergency she was planning for." A cold dread washed over me, but I didn't try to stop him. He was no longer a child I could protect from the world's ugliness. He was a man who had a right to uncover the full extent of the deception that had been his marriage. He called Hope on his way over, and in a surprising but welcome turn, she agreed to meet him there. Her motives were a murky blend of familial guilt, a deep-seated resentment of her sister's manipulative nature, and perhaps a flicker of genuine human decency. Whatever the reason, she had chosen her side, and it was with us. I spent the next few hours in a state of suspended anxiety, pacing my small living room, waiting for the phone to ring. The 60-day clock was down to its final days. The final hearing where the judge would sign the decree was scheduled for the end of the week. Patricia had everything she needed to file our motion to invalidate the settlement and enforce the trust. We had the financial records, the private investigator's report, the signed agreement itself. Our case was ironclad, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Michael was about to find something that would change the very nature of the game we were playing. The call came just before noon. Michael's voice was tight, strained, as if the words themselves were sharp objects he was struggling to force out of his throat. "Mom," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "you need to come over here, and you need to call Patricia. Tell her to meet us, now." I didn't ask questions. The raw, visceral horror in my son's voice was more eloquent than any explanation. I called Patricia, who, after hearing the urgency in my tone, agreed to meet me at the Westlake house immediately. When I pulled into the driveway 20 minutes later, Michael's car was there, along with Hope's. The house looked exactly the same. The manicured lawn, the cheerful yellow front door, the blooming azaleas I had planted years ago. It was a perfect picture of suburban tranquility, a beautiful facade hiding a dark and rotten core. Michael opened the door before I could even ring the bell. His face was ashen. He led me wordlessly through the house to the master bedroom. Hope was sitting on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale and drawn. On the floor, by the closet, sat a small, gray, fireproof safe, its door hanging open, and spread out on the large, king-sized bed was a collection of documents that made my blood run cold. It was Paige's entire battle plan, meticulously organized, clinically detailed, and utterly monstrous. Michael picked up the first folder, his hand trembling slightly. "This is an annotated copy of your will, Mom," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. In the margins, in Paige's neat, precise handwriting, were notes. Next to the clause leaving the house to Michael, she had written, "Challengeable. Deed transfer supersedes." Next to a bequest for a favorite charity, she had noted, "Liquidate for capital." She had dissected the document of my final wishes with the cold, detached eye of a corporate raider planning a hostile takeover. The next file was even more chilling. It was a timeline, a detailed step-by-step plan for the dissolution of my marriage and the acquisition of my assets. It started over a year ago with entries like, Step 1. Build R's confidence. Emphasize dissatisfaction with C. It continued, month by month, with nauseating detail. Step 4. Suggest amicable legal counsel, Jensen. Control the narrative. And Step 7. Introduce concept of happiness and fresh start to C. Frame as a kindness. My entire emotional ordeal, the pain and confusion I had suffered, had been a scripted performance, and I was the unwitting lead actress. But it was the last two documents that pushed the situation from the realm of a vicious, greedy divorce into something far darker, something truly criminal. The first was a private investigator's report, but this was not the one Patricia had commissioned. This was one Paige had ordered, dated 6 months prior. It was a complete workup on me, my daily routines, my financial holdings, my medical history. She had been studying me, learning my patterns, my vulnerabilities. It was a predator's file on its prey. And then, tucked into the back of the investigator's report, was the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle. It was a life insurance application, a multi-million-dollar policy on my life. The application was a forgery, my signature expertly but recognizably faked. And the sole beneficiary, the person who would receive the massive payout upon my death, was listed not as my son, not as my husband, but as Paige Carter Moore. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the air leaving my lungs in a rush. My hand went to my chest. This wasn't just about money anymore. This wasn't about a house. This was about my life. She wasn't just planning to divorce me, to steal from me. She was planning for my death. She had put a price on my head and was preparing to cash in. The calculated, cold-blooded premeditation of it was beyond anything I could have ever imagined. Paige was not just a manipulative narcissist. She was a predator. Patricia arrived a few minutes later. She walked into the bedroom, her sharp professional gaze taking in the scene. The open safe, my ashen face, Michael's trembling fury, the damning documents spread across the bed like the entrails of a sacrificial animal. She picked up the forged life insurance policy, her expression hardening into a mask of cold, controlled anger. She read it, then reread it. She examined the other documents with a swift, efficient eye. When she was done, she looked not at me, but at Michael. "Did you touch anything else in that safe?" she asked, her voice sharp. Michael shook his head. "No, just these files." "Good," she said. She pulled out her phone. "We are no longer in the realm of civil litigation. This is a criminal matter." She looked at me, her eyes conveying the gravity of the situation. "Caroline, what I am about to do will change everything. It will escalate this beyond your control, beyond my control. It will involve the police, the district attorney. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at the forged document in her hand. I thought of Paige's smile, the calculated sweetness that hid a soul as black and as cold as a winter midnight. I thought of her calling my son sweet but simple, as she plotted to make herself the beneficiary of my death. There was only one possible answer. "Do it," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Patricia made the call. She didn't speak to a paralegal or a desk sergeant. She called a name I didn't recognize, someone high up speaking in a low, urgent tone. When she hung up, she looked at us. "A Detective Daniel Martinez from the Austin PD Financial Crimes Unit is on his way. He's one of the best. Do not touch anything. Do not leave this room. This is now a potential crime scene." The wait for the detective was the longest 20 minutes of my life. The four of us, me, Michael, Patricia, and a now terrified Hope, sat in the silent bedroom, the evidence of Paige's monstrous ambition laid bare between us. This had started as a betrayal, a wound inflicted by the two people I should have been able to trust most in the world. But it had evolved into something else entirely. We had uncovered a darkness so profound it threatened to swallow us all. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was a felony. And my fight for my home had just become a fight for my life. The final 48 hours of the 60-day countdown were a blur of controlled chaos, a stark contrast to the quiet, methodical patience that had defined my strategy for 2 months. My home, my grandfather's home, was no longer just a contested asset in a divorce. It was a crime scene. Detective Daniel Martinez was a man whose calm, deliberate presence belied the sharp, analytical intensity in his eyes. He and his team moved through the bedroom with a quiet efficiency, photographing, documenting, and carefully bagging every piece of paper from Paige's safe. The forged life insurance policy was handled with the reverence one might afford a venomous snake. Patricia Harris was a whirlwind of legal energy, on the phone constantly with the district attorney's office, her voice a low, urgent hum. The civil case we had so meticulously built was now secondary, eclipsed by the shadow of a burgeoning criminal investigation into insurance fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Richard and Paige's amicable divorce had spiraled into something far beyond their control, and they were still, unbelievably, oblivious. They were sipping cocktails on the deck of the Titanic, celebrating the speed of their journey, unaware of the iceberg dead ahead. The day the 60-day waiting period expired was the day of the final hearing, the day a judge would officially dissolve my 38-year marriage. But we were not in a civil courtroom that morning. Instead, Michael and I were in a sterile conference room at the Austin Police Department, giving our official statements to Detective Martinez. As I recounted the story from Hope's first visit to the discovery in the safe, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were narrating the plot of a particularly grim novel. The final piece of the puzzle, however, came not from me, but from Hope. Pale and trembling, she sat with the detective and told him something she had held back, something she had dismissed as a strange, morbid comment at the time, but which now took on a terrifying new significance. She spoke of her Aunt Elena, a wealthy, childless widow on Paige's side of the family who had died suddenly of a heart attack 2 years prior. Elena had doted on Paige, but had always been wary of her ambition. "A few weeks before Elena died," Hope whispered, her voice barely audible, "Paige made a comment. We were talking about Elena's estate, and Paige laughed and said, "Some older women just don't know when it's time to get out of the way. Sometimes you have to help them find the exit." I thought it was just a horrible, tasteless joke. Detective Martinez's expression did not change, but I saw him make a swift, sharp note on his pad. My blood ran cold. The forged life insurance policy wasn't Paige's first attempt at profiting from death. It was a pattern. We left the police station in a state of grim shock. The final divorce hearing had been postponed, pending the criminal investigation. Patricia had filed our motion to invalidate the settlement, along with a temporary restraining order preventing Richard or Paige from entering the Westlake property. The trap was no longer just legal, it was physical. The locks on the house had been changed that morning. We knew they were coming. Their sense of entitlement was so absolute, their belief in their victory so complete, that they would not wait for a final decree. They had my signature. In their minds, the house was already theirs. We didn't have to wait long. Just after 3 o'clock that afternoon, a large white moving truck rumbled down our quiet, tree-lined street and stopped in front of the house. It was followed moments later by Richard's gleaming BMW. Michael, Hope, and I stood on the porch, a silent, unified front. The restraining order was taped to the inside of the new front door. Michael's stance was solid, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of cold, unyielding fury. He was no longer the son, he was the guardian. Hope stood slightly behind him, her presence a quiet but powerful statement of her allegiance. Richard and Paige got out of the car. They were laughing. Paige was wearing crisp white linen pants and sunglasses perched on her head, looking for all the world like a woman arriving to take possession of her new kingdom. She was pointing at the rose bushes, saying something to Richard about tearing them out. Their laughter died the moment they saw us. Paige's face, which had been bright with triumphant glee, curdled into a mask of pure, venomous rage. "What the hell are you doing here?" she shrieked, her voice echoing in the quiet suburban street. "And who are you?" she snarled at Hope, a look of utter betrayal on her face. Richard looked confused, his bravado instantly evaporating, replaced by a nervous uncertainty. "Caroline? Michael? What's going on? The movers are here." "The movers can leave," Michael said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that I had never heard from him before. "You're not welcome here." Paige stormed up the walkway, her heels clicking angrily on the flagstones. She was a hurricane of self-righteous fury. "Not welcome? This is my house," she screamed, jabbing a finger toward the front door. "We have a signed agreement. Your mother gave it to us. Now get out of the way before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." "I wouldn't do that if I were you," I said, my voice calm and clear, cutting through her tirade. It was the first time I had spoken. My calm seemed to infuriate her more than Michael's anger. She whirled on me, her eyes blazing. You think you can pull a stunt like this? After you signed the papers? You pathetic old woman, the deal is done. You lost. Now get your son and your traitor sister off my porch." 2 burly movers had gotten out of the truck and were standing uncertainly on the sidewalk, watching the drama unfold. Richard finally found his voice, stepping forward and placing a placating hand on Paige's arm. "Now let's all just calm down," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Caroline, this isn't like you. We had an agreement, an amicable agreement." "Our definition of amicable seems to differ, Richard," I said, my gaze steady. "Mine doesn't typically include fraud, forgery, or conspiracy." The words hit the air like stones. Richard's face went slack with confusion. Paige, however, froze. For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear appeared in her eyes. It was a small, almost imperceptible shift, but I saw it. The word forgery had landed. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she snapped, but her voice had lost its confident, shrieking edge. It was brittle now. "Don't you?" I asked softly. I took a step forward to the edge of the porch, so I was looking down at her. "You are a planner, Paige. You document everything. We know. We've seen it all. The annotated will, the timeline of your manipulation, the private investigator's report you commissioned on my life." Richard was staring at Paige now, his mouth slightly open, a dawning horror on his face. Paige? What is she talking about? But Paige's eyes were locked on mine. The rage was gone, replaced by a frantic, cornered animal panic. I let my voice drop, making it almost conversational, but loud enough for Richard and the movers to hear. But the life insurance policy was the most ambitious part, wasn't it? Forging my signature, making yourself the sole beneficiary. That was a bold move, a felony, I believe. Richard physically recoiled from her, taking a step back as if she had suddenly burst into flames. "Life insurance?" he whispered, his voice choked with disbelief. Paige's face was a deathly white. "You're lying," she hissed, but there was no conviction in it. "You have no proof." "Oh, but we do," I said. "It's all in an evidence bag down at the Austin Police Department." Detective Martinez was very interested in it. He said it establishes a clear pattern of predatory behavior. I paused, letting the weight of that sink in. He was especially interested after Hope mentioned her Aunt Elena's very sudden, very convenient heart attack a couple of years ago. That was the final blow. At the mention of Elena, all the fight drained out of Paige in a rush. The mask of the beautiful, confident manipulator shattered, revealing the terrified, malevolent creature beneath. She looked from my face to Michael's to Hope's and saw not a broken family, but a unified, unbreakable wall of accusation. He told us the police would be reopening that case. I continued, my voice still relentlessly calm. They're very interested in what an autopsy might find, even after all this time. Digitalis poisoning, for instance, is often mistaken for a heart attack, but it lingers in the tissues for a very long time. Paige paled, a sickly, greenish tint under her skin. She stumbled back a step, her bravado completely gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear. Richard, finally comprehending the abyss that had just opened up at his feet, began to back away toward his car, his hands held up as if to ward off a physical blow. "I didn't know," he stammered, his eyes wide with panic. "I didn't know about any of that. I had nothing to do with it." He was no longer her partner. He was a rat deserting a sinking, burning ship. Paige shot him a look of pure hatred before turning her terrified gaze back to me. She had come here for a triumphant takeover. Instead, she was standing in the ruins of her life, with the specter of a murder investigation looming over her. "The only secrets burning down today are yours, Paige," I said, my voice a final, quiet judgment. She turned and fled. She didn't walk. She ran, stumbling in her expensive heels, yanking open the passenger door of the BMW and scrambling inside. Richard, without a backward glance, got into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and the car peeled away from the curb, leaving a strip of black rubber on the asphalt of the life they had tried, and failed, to steal. The moving truck, after a moment of stunned silence, quietly started its engine and rumbled away down the street. The quiet returned, deeper and more profound than before. We stood on the porch, the restraining order fluttering in the sudden breeze, and watched them go. The standoff was over. The victory was ours. The squeal of the BMW's tires faded into the suburban quiet, leaving a vacuum in its wake. The scent of burnt rubber hung in the warm Texas air, a final, acrid signature of their panicked retreat. For a long moment, the three of us just stood on the porch, the silence stretching, ringing with the echoes of Paige's shrieks and Richard's stammered denials. The battle was over. The enemy had been routed, but the adrenaline of the confrontation gave way to a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The war, I knew, was far from finished, but this decisive public victory felt like the turning of a great and terrible tide. Michael was the first to move. He let out a long, shuddering breath he seemed to have been holding for days, for months, for his entire marriage. He walked over to the porch railing and leaned against it, his head bowed, the rigid, protective posture of the guardian finally dissolving. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was just a man, my son, grappling with the smoking crater that had once been his life. "I can't believe it," he said, his voice low and raspy. "All of it. The insurance, Aunt Elena, it's monstrous." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a fresh, deeper pain. "I was married to her, Mom. I slept next to that monster." I loved her. I went to him, placing my hand on his back. His muscles were knotted with tension. You loved the person she pretended to be, Michael, I said gently. You fell in love with a mask. It's not your fault you didn't see the monster underneath. None of us did. Hope stepped forward, her expression a complex mixture of shame, relief, and a quiet, resolute strength. She fooled everyone, she said, her voice soft but firm. She fooled our entire family for years, me included, but I should have known. The little cruelties, the way she talked about people, I ignored it. I'm so sorry, Michael. And Caroline, I'm so sorry I didn't speak up sooner. You spoke up when it counted, Hope, Michael said, reaching out and taking her hand. It was a simple, instinctive gesture of comfort, but it felt significant, a small bridge being built across the chasm of his wife's, her sister's betrayal. You were the one who told me where to look. We wouldn't have found any of this without you. Their hands stayed linked for a moment longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement of their shared trauma, of the strange and terrible bond that had been forged between them. They were the only two people on Earth who truly understood the specific contours of Paige's deception from the inside. Inside, the house felt cavernous and strange. The locks had been changed, the legal papers were in order, but the ghost of their presence lingered. I saw the swatch of gaudy metallic paint Paige had left on the kitchen counter and swept it into the trash. I saw the indentations on the sofa where Richard had spent so many nights furtively texting his lover while I sat just a few feet away. The house was mine again, but it was also haunted, tainted by the memory of their plotting. It was no longer a home. It was a reclamation project, not just of property, but of peace. That evening, Patricia Harris came over. She didn't look triumphant, only grimly satisfied, like a surgeon who has just completed a difficult but necessary amputation. She sat at my kitchen table, a place of so much recent pain, and laid out the next steps. They will be desperate, she said, her voice crisp and devoid of sentiment. Richard will try to distance himself from Paige completely. His lawyer, the golf buddy, has already called me twice, blustering about harassment and slander. Paige's family will likely hire the most vicious criminal defense attorney in the state. They will try to paint you as a bitter, vengeful woman, Michael as a scorned husband, and Hope as a jealous sister. Will it work? Michael asked, his voice tight. No, Patricia said with absolute certainty, because they are arguing against emotion. We are arguing with facts. We have the signed settlement, a document in which they essentially confess to their fraudulent intentions. We have the forged insurance policy. We have the private investigator's report she commissioned. And now, thanks to Hope, the district attorney has a compelling reason to seek an exhumation order for Elena's body. Paige's life as she knows it is over. The question now is how many people she takes down with her. The word victory felt hollow. I looked around my kitchen, at the faces of my son and the young woman who had become an unlikely ally. We had won the battle for the house, but the cost was immense. My son's marriage was a toxic ruin. My own marriage was not just over. It was revealed to have been a lie for years. A woman was likely dead. There was no joy in this, only a grim, necessary justice. I don't want revenge, Patricia, I said quietly. I never did. I just wanted to protect myself, to protect my son. Patricia's gaze softened for the first time that evening. I know that, Caroline. But you must understand, this is no longer just about you. What you've uncovered is a pattern of predatory behavior that is now a matter of public safety. You didn't just protect yourself. You may have saved the next person she decided was an obstacle. Her words hung in the air, chilling and profound. We had not just been fighting for a house, we had been fighting to stop a predator. In the days that followed, we began to establish new boundaries, to redraw the map of our lives. The first boundary was Richard. He called incessantly. He texted. He left long, rambling voicemails filled with panicked apologies and transparent attempts to rewrite history. Carol, I had no idea. She lied to me too. We can fix this. I never stopped loving you. The messages were a pathetic cocktail of fear and self-preservation. He wasn't sorry for the affair. He was terrified of being named as an accomplice in a felony investigation. He didn't miss me. He missed my money, my stability, the comfortable life he had so carelessly thrown away. I listened to the first voicemail, my expression impassive, then deleted it. I did the same with the second and the third. Then, with Michael's guidance, I blocked his number. I blocked his email. I severed the final digital threads that connected us. My compassion, a resource he had strip-mined for decades, was now a closed account. It would be reserved for those who deserved it. For my son, for Hope, for myself. Michael, in turn, began the painful process of his own amputation. He filed for divorce, the petition citing adultery and fraud. He and Hope worked together, methodically sorting through the life he had shared with Paige, separating the truths from the lies. It was a painful, ugly process, but they did it together, their shared integrity a quiet source of strength. I watched them, a strange sense of hope blooming in the wreckage. They were two good, honorable people who had been betrayed by the ones they should have been able to trust most. In their shared disillusionment, they were finding a new, more honest connection. The house, too, began its slow transformation. We opened all the windows, letting the fresh air chase out the stale energy of deceit. I took down the photos of Richard, packing them away in a box in the attic. We didn't burn them, we simply archived them, remnants of a life that no longer existed. Michael helped me move the furniture, rearranging the living room, breaking the old, familiar patterns. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. We were reclaiming the space, not just legally, but emotionally. We were making it ours again. One afternoon, Michael and I were sitting on the back patio, the one Richard and I had built together. The sun was warm on my face. The cicadas buzzed in the old oak tree. For the first time in a long time, the familiar sounds of my home did not feel like a mockery. They felt like a welcome. "We won today, Mom," Michael said quietly, looking out over the yard. "Yes, we did," I said. "But justice is still ahead. This was just the first step." He nodded, understanding. This was not a neat, tidy ending. This was the beginning of a long, difficult road through the legal system. There would be trials, there would be headlines. Our private pain would become a public spectacle, but we would face it together. I looked at the mighty oak tree that dominated the yard, a tree that had been there for 100 years. It had been battered by countless Texas storms, its branches twisted and scarred, but it was still standing, its roots deep, its leaves green and vibrant in the afternoon sun. I felt a kinship with that old tree. I had been bent, but I had not been broken. "Justice moves slowly," I said, as much to myself as to him. "But it moves." And for the first time since this nightmare began, I truly believed it. We had won the battle for the ground beneath our feet. Now we would simply stand firm and wait for the slow, inevitable grinding of the wheels of justice. The wheels of justice, as I had predicted, moved with a slow, deliberate, and inexorable force. The weeks following the driveway standoff were not filled with dramatic confrontations, but with the quiet, methodical work of the legal system. The world shrank to a series of meetings in sterile rooms with Patricia, with Detective Martinez, with prosecutors from the district attorney's office. Our lives, once defined by family dinners and quiet evenings, were now measured in depositions, evidence logs, and upcoming court dates. The first blow landed on Richard. His golf buddy lawyer, Bob Jensen, facing a potential ethics investigation for his role in drafting the fraudulent settlement, dropped him as a client. Richard, stripped of his bravado and his well-connected counsel, was forced to hire a cut-rate attorney who advised him to do the one thing he was best at: capitulate. Faced with a mountain of evidence that he was, at best, a willful accomplice and at worst a co-conspirator in Paige's schemes, he accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of conspiracy to commit fraud. He was spared jail time, but the consequences were devastating in their own way. He was sentenced to 5 years of probation, a hefty fine that wiped out his secret accounts, and 500 hours of community service. His business, built on my family's money and a reputation for ruthless competence, crumbled. Clients fled. His name, once a mark of success in the Austin business community, became a synonym for scandal. He was ruined, not by a dramatic courtroom battle, but by the quiet, irrefutable weight of his own signed confession on the settlement agreement. I felt no triumph in his downfall, only a profound and weary sadness for the man he could have been, for the life we could have had. He had traded 38 years of partnership for a fantasy, and the price was his entire world. The case against Page was a different matter entirely. It was not a quiet plea deal. It was a full-blown criminal prosecution that played out under the glare of the local media. The story was irresistible. The beautiful, manipulative wife, the wealthy older aunt, the forged insurance policy, the dramatic confrontation. We were no longer just a family. We were a local news sensation. Our private tragedy turned into a cautionary tale. The most crucial piece of evidence came a month into the investigation. The exhumation of Aunt Elena's body, a grim and necessary violation, yielded the truth Page had tried to bury. The Travis County Medical Examiner's report was unequivocal. Elena had not died of a heart attack. Her tissues contained lethal levels of digitalis, a heart medication that, when administered in high doses to a healthy person, perfectly mimics the symptoms of cardiac arrest. The tasteless joke Page had made to her sister years ago was no longer a joke. It was a confession. The day Page was arrested for the murder of her aunt, in addition to the charges of insurance fraud, identity theft, and forgery, was a gray, drizzly Tuesday. I saw it on the evening news, a live shot of her being led from her parents' lavish home in handcuffs. The mask of the beautiful, confident woman was gone completely. Her face was pale and puffy, her hair a mess, her designer clothes looking cheap and out of place against the grim reality of her predicament. She looked small, pathetic, and utterly broken. As they put her in the back of the police car, she looked up, and for a moment her eyes met the camera. They were not the eyes of a monster. They were the empty, soulless eyes of a void, a person who had been so consumed by greed that she had devoured her own humanity. I turned off the television and sat in the quiet of my living room. There was no surge of victory, no feeling of righteous vindication. There was only a profound and hollow ache. This was the end of the road that had begun with a slice of pecan pie on my sunny patio. A marriage was destroyed, a son's heart was broken, a life was ruined, a woman was dead. The cost of their greed was immeasurable. The trials, Michael's divorce and the state of Texas versus Page Moore, proceeded in tandem. Michael's was a simple, open and shut case. The evidence of adultery and fraud was so overwhelming that the judge granted the divorce in a single, swift hearing. The fraudulent settlement agreement was declared null and void, and my grandfather's trust, the shield he had forged for me half a century ago, was fully enforced. The court affirmed that the house, the business, and all connected assets were, and always had been, my sole and separate property, reverting to me entirely due to Richard's proven infidelity. The legal victory was absolute. Page's criminal trial was a much longer, uglier affair. Her expensive lawyers tried to paint her as a victim, a troubled young woman manipulated by a powerful, older man. They tried to discredit Hope's testimony. They tried to portray me as a vengeful matriarch, but they could not argue with the evidence. They could not argue with the forged signature on the insurance policy. They could not argue with the digitalis in her aunt's tissues. They could not argue with the cold, methodical timeline of her own ambition written in her own hand. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. The verdict was guilty. On all counts. I was not in the courtroom the day she was sentenced. Michael and Hope went, not for vengeance, but for closure. He called me from the courthouse steps afterward. "Life in prison," he said, his voice heavy. "No possibility of parole for the murder charge. The other sentences will run concurrently." Life. She had tried to steal my life, my future, and in the end, she had forfeited her own. A life sentence, to be lived out in a world of concrete and steel, a world stripped of the beauty, luxury, and power she had coveted so desperately that she was willing to kill for it. That evening, the three of us, me, Michael, and Hope, sat on the back patio. We didn't talk about the trial or the sentence. We talked about the future. Michael, finally untethered from the toxicity of his marriage, was making plans to travel, to rediscover the person he was outside of Paige's shadow. Hope, having found the courage to break with her family's dysfunctional loyalty, was applying to graduate programs in social work, wanting to turn her painful experience into a way of helping others. As I listened to them, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet, gentle thing I had not felt in years. I had been dragged through the darkest, ugliest parts of human nature. I had been betrayed, targeted, and threatened. But I had not been broken. My anger had not curdled into bitterness. My pain had not soured into a desire for revenge. I had fought, not to destroy them, but to protect what was mine, my home, my son, and my self-respect. We had survived. We had survived with our integrity intact. A few days later, I went through the box of Richard's things I had stored in the attic. I found the photographs of our wedding, of our trips to Paris, of the day Michael was born. I looked at the face of the young man I had married, full of hope and promise, and I felt a pang of grief for him, for us, for the life that had been lost not just to infidelity, but to a slow, creeping rot of character. I did not destroy the photos. I simply closed the box and pushed it back into the corner of the attic. That part of my life was over, a chapter finished, a story told. It was time to write a new one. My own legal battles were finished. The house was mine. The business, a hollowed-out shell of its former self, was mine to dissolve. My future, which they had tried to so ruthlessly foreclose on, was once again a blank page. The law had struck, and justice, in its slow, methodical, and imperfect way, had been served. The storm had passed, and in the quiet aftermath, for the first time in a very long time, I could finally begin to heal. Autumn arrived in Austin not with a dramatic flourish, but with a gentle sigh. The relentless summer sun softened, its heat giving way to a golden, benevolent warmth. The leaves on my old oak tree began their slow, graceful transition from green to amber. It was a season of change, of letting go, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt myself changing with it. The legal battles were over, the headlines had faded, and the silence left behind was no longer the heavy, ringing silence of shock, but the clean, quiet space of a new beginning. The house, once a crime scene, a battlefield, a museum of painful memories, was slowly becoming a home again. The ghosts of Richard and Paige were fading, their presence scrubbed away not with anger, but with the daily rituals of a life being reclaimed. I filled the rooms with music, the classical piano I had loved as a girl, but had given up somewhere along the road of my marriage. I bought new cookbooks and tried recipes that were spicy and adventurous, things Richard, with his predictable palate, would never have touched. I reclaimed the small spaces they had occupied, turning Richard's cavernous, dark wood study into a bright, airy sunroom filled with plants. Each new leaf that unfurled felt like a small, personal victory. I decided to host a dinner. Not a formal, obligatory family gathering like the ones that had become so fraught with tension, but a celebration. It was early November, around the time of Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. The holiday, with its beautiful tradition of honoring the past while celebrating the life that continues, felt deeply appropriate. We were not mourning what we had lost. We were honoring our survival and celebrating the future we were building from the ashes. The guest list was small, but significant. It was not a family of blood, but a family forged in the fires of loyalty and integrity. Michael and Hope were there, of course. Their connection, born from a shared trauma, had blossomed into something quiet, tender, and deeply real. They had spent the past few months helping each other heal, their shared experience creating a foundation of honesty and understanding that was the antithesis of the deceptive partnerships they had both escaped. Watching them together, I saw not a rebound, but a recognition, two kind souls who had found a safe harbor in each other. Patricia Harris came, shedding her formidable lawyer persona for the evening and revealing a woman with a warm laugh and a sharp, insightful wit. I invited a few of my oldest friends, women who had stood by me with quiet, unquestioning support, bringing casseroles and comfort when I needed them most. And I invited my neighbors, a young couple who had watched the entire drama unfold with a mixture of horror and sympathy, and who had started checking on me, bringing me my mail. Their simple, decent kindness, a welcome balm. My dining room, the stage for Paige's cruel Sunday performance, was transformed. I decorated the table not with my grandmother's formal wedding china, but with colorful, hand-painted Mexican pottery. Marigolds, bright and cheerful, spilled from rustic clay vases. The food was a feast of life. Mole, tamales, fresh tortillas, bowls of vibrant salsa. The air was filled not with tension and unspoken resentments, but with laughter, with the easy, overlapping conversations of people who were genuinely happy to be in one another's company. We sat around the table, a strange and wonderful collection of survivors, and I felt a sense of belonging that was more profound than anything I had felt in years. This was real. This was a family built not on obligation or shared history, but on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. Halfway through the meal, Michael stood up, his wine glass in his hand. A hush fell over the table. He looked around at all of us, his gaze finally resting on Hope, who was looking up at him with a soft, trusting smile. "I don't have a lot of eloquent words," he began, his voice thick with an emotion that was no longer pain, but a deep and quiet joy. "The last year, it's been about tearing things down, about endings, about discovering that the foundation of my life was a lie." He paused, his eyes meeting mine across the table. "But tonight isn't about that. Tonight is about what gets built in the aftermath. It's about the people who show up, who stand with you, who tell you the truth even when it's hard." He turned his full attention to Hope. "No one has stood with me more or been more honest or shown me more about what real courage and integrity look like than you, Hope." He took a small box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a simple, elegant ring, not a flashy diamond, but a deep blue sapphire. "I know it's soon. I know we've both been through hell, but I also know I don't want to build my future with anyone else. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Hope's eyes as a radiant smile spread across her face. She simply nodded, unable to speak, as he slid the ring onto her finger. The table erupted in applause and happy tears. I watched my son, my kind, good son, who had been so cruelly deceived, find a chance at a true and honest love. The sight filled the hollowed-out spaces in my heart. His happiness was not a balm on my wounds. It was proof that my own healing was possible. Later, Patricia raised her glass. "To Caroline," she said, her voice clear and strong. A woman who reminded all of us that grace is not the same as weakness, and that the quietest person in the room is often the strongest. As our glasses clinked, I looked around at the faces of my new family. I thought of the woman I had been a year ago, the quiet, accommodating wife, the doting mother who had slowly allowed herself to become invisible. I had been so afraid of losing the life I had, so terrified of being alone. And now I had lost it all, and I had never felt less alone in my life. The demolition of my old life had been a terrifying, painful, and profoundly violent event, but it had also been a liberation. It had cleared the ground, leveled the faulty foundation, and given me the chance to build something new, something stronger, something real. I realized then that the greatest betrayals do not just break your heart, they break you open. They shatter the illusions you have been living with, forcing you to confront the truth not just about others, but about yourself. I had been complicit in my own diminishment for years, trading my own voice for a fragile peace, my own needs for the comfort of others. The pain of Richard and Paige's betrayal had been the catalyst, the violent external force that had finally forced me to save myself. The dinner party ended late, with warm hugs and promises to gather again soon. After everyone had gone, I stood alone in my quiet, happy kitchen, the scent of marigolds and good food still lingering in the air. I was not the same woman who had served pecan pie to her husband's mistress's sister. That woman was gone. She was a part of the past I was honoring, but she was not the person who would be living my future. I had always thought of loss as a subtraction, a hollowing out. But as I stood there, surrounded by the evidence of a new and vibrant life, I understood that it could also be a gift. Sometimes the greatest gifts we receive are the ones that arrive disguised as losses, the ones that force us to become the architects of our own rescue. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of my second act. And for the first time, I was the one writing the script. The seasons turned, and with them, the final vestiges of my old life were put gently to rest. The Westlake house, the sprawling stage upon which so much of my life, both the beautiful and the horrific, had played out, was sold. The decision was not difficult. To stay there would have been to live among ghosts, to walk through rooms forever imprinted with the shadows of betrayal. I needed more than a rearranged living room. I needed a new horizon. I sold it to a young family with noisy, laughing children, and on the day I handed them the keys, I felt not a pang of loss, but a profound sense of release. I was not just giving them a house, I was liberating myself from its history. The assets from my grandfather's trust, now fully and legally mine, were considerable. The dissolution of Richard's ruined business and the sale of the house had left me with a fortune I had never anticipated, a fortune that felt less like a windfall and more like a responsibility. For weeks, I contemplated what to do with it. I could have traveled the world. I could have bought a penthouse with a panoramic view of the city. But the quiet, pragmatic teacher in me, the woman who had spent a lifetime nurturing potential, knew that this money was not meant for a life of idle luxury. It was meant to build something. The small two-bedroom condo in North Austin, the one Richard and Paige had so generously allotted me in their fraudulent settlement, had become a symbol in my mind. It was their vision of my future, a quiet, contained, and diminished existence. It represented the cage they had tried to build for me. I decided to take that symbol and transform it, to turn their intended prison into a place of freedom. I used a portion of the trust to purchase the entire top floor of that condominium building. And then, with Patricia Harris's expert legal guidance and the enthusiastic help of Michael and Hope, I began the most important project of my life. We established a nonprofit foundation, naming it The Moore Legacy, not for Richard, but for my grandfather, the man whose foresight had saved me. Its mission was simple and born directly from the crucible of my own experience, to provide a haven for women, particularly older women, who were rebuilding their lives after devastating divorces. The space was converted from a series of individual condos into a beautiful communal living sanctuary. We called it the Phoenix House. It was not a shelter in the traditional sense, but a launch pad. It offered temporary subsidized housing for women who, like me, had found themselves financially and emotionally blindsided. But more than that, it offered resources. We brought in financial advisors to help women untangle their assets and plan for their futures. We provided legal aid clinics, career counseling, and therapy. It was a place to heal, but also a place to arm oneself with the knowledge and confidence that had been stripped away. It was everything I had needed and had been forced to find on my own. My days, once measured by Richard's schedule and the rhythms of a quiet suburban life, were now filled with a vibrant, demanding purpose. I was not just the founder. I was an active presence at the Phoenix House. I taught workshops on financial literacy, my old classroom skills finding a new and vital application. I sat with women who were in the depths of the same shock and grief I had known, not as a counselor, but as living proof that survival was possible. I shared my story not for sympathy, but to show them that they were not alone, that their pain was not a sign of weakness, but a testament to their capacity for trust and love. One afternoon, a woman in her late 60s, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, but her back ramrod straight, told me, "They make you feel so stupid, like you should have known." "It's not stupidity to trust the person you love," I told her, my voice gentle but firm. "The shame does not belong to you. It belongs to the one who broke the trust." In helping them, I was continuing to heal myself. Their stories were all different, yet heartbreakingly the same. They were tales of quiet manipulation, of financial control disguised as help, of being slowly, methodically diminished until they no longer recognized themselves. In their collective experience, my own story found its context and its meaning. I was not just an anomaly, I was part of a silent, invisible army of women who had been underestimated. My relationship with Michael and Hope blossomed into the kind of deep, honest family connection I had always craved. They were married in a simple, beautiful ceremony in the Zilker Botanical Garden, surrounded by the small, loyal circle of friends who had become our true family. There was no grand reception, no ostentatious display. It was a celebration of authenticity, of a love built not on performance, but on a foundation of shared values and profound mutual respect. I no longer needed to be the all-providing matriarch. I was simply their mother and friend, a part of their lives, not the center of it. The texts I received from them were no longer pleas for help or logistical questions, but snapshots of a happy life being built. A photo from a hiking trip, a funny story about their newly adopted dog, an invitation for a casual weeknight dinner. Their happiness was my peace. One quiet evening, as I was preparing to leave the Phoenix house, I found my old wedding ring in a forgotten corner of my jewelry box. I had taken it off the day I signed the settlement, and I hadn't looked at it since. It was a simple gold band, worn smooth from nearly 4 decades of wear. I held it in the palm of my hand, this small, circular symbol of a promise that had been broken, of a life that had been a lie. There was no anger left, no bitterness. There was only a quiet sense of finality. It was a relic from another woman's life. I walked to the small, secure safe where we kept the foundation's important documents, opened it, and placed the ring inside. I didn't want to sell it or throw it away. It was a part of my history, a reminder of the journey that had brought me here. It would rest there, in the heart of the foundation born from its ashes, a silent testament to the fact that even the most profound endings can lead to the most meaningful new beginnings. As I locked the safe and turned to leave, my phone buzzed with a text from Michael. It was a picture, taken from the porch of their new home. It was a photo of the ancient gnarled oak tree in my old yard, its branches silhouetted against a brilliant, fiery sunset. It was the same tree that had stood sentinel over my life, that had witnessed my joy and my deepest despair. It had been bent by countless storms, its bark scarred, its limbs twisted. But it was still there, its roots holding fast, its branches reaching for the sky. It was not perfect. It was a survivor. Beneath the photo, Michael had written a simple caption. "It's blooming again this spring, Mom." A slow smile spread across my face. I looked out the window of my office at the glittering lights of the city. I was Caroline Moore. I had been a wife, a mother, a teacher. I had been betrayed. I had been underestimated. I had been targeted. But now I was something more. I was the architect of my own future. I was a survivor who had chosen not revenge, but renewal. I was the founder of a haven. I was a woman who, having been forced through the fire, had learned to bloom again. And it was spring. This story is a testament to the quiet strength that is so often underestimated. It teaches us that grace is not weakness, and silence is not surrender, but a space where strategy is born. Betrayal, though devastating, can be the catalyst that forces us to reclaim our power, shedding a life of invisibility for one of purpose. It reminds us that our deepest wounds can become the source of our greatest transformations. True liberation is not found in revenge, but in rebuilding a future on our own terms, choosing to bloom again, stronger and more authentic than before. Now, if you liked this story, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me which part surprised you the most. Each subscription and comment from you is a great motivation for us to keep sharing more meaningful things in life. Thank you very much.